So it's the second day of Holy Week, Monday morning. Yesterday we saw Jesus going to Jerusalem with his disciples in the back of a colt, and everyone is happy to see him. They believe that he is the Messiah, he is the king that's come to reestablish Israel. So Sunday was one vibe, Monday is going to be another, because Jesus is going to return to Jerusalem, but he's going to return with judgment. Mark 11, verse 12. On the following day, when they came from Bethany, he was hungry, and he, Jesus, seeing in the distance a fig tree and leaf, he went to see if he could find anything on it. When he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. And he said to it, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." And his disciples heard it. And so he curses this fig tree, but for Jesus, the fig tree represents Israel. You see, especially in the Old Testament, Israel and the fig tree were usually synonymous, because Jesus saw and God sees Israel as a tree that's supposed to bear fruit and supposed to take care of other people. But if it doesn't, then God's going to have to remove that. In fact, we see in Zechariah 10, when God raises up Joshua the high priest. Joshua is supposed to be over the temple and really over Israel. He tells Joshua that he is going to help him create a place where other people can encounter God. In verse 10 it says, "In that day, declares the Lord of hosts, every one of you will invite his neighbor to come under his vine and under his fig tree," which is Israel. God wants Israel to be a place where people meet God in a unique and powerful way. Unfortunately, Israel isn't doing that, as we see here in Mark 11. In fact, Jesus continues, goes up to Jerusalem in verse 15 and says, "And they came to Jerusalem, and he entered the temple and began to drive those who sold and those who bought in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. And he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. And he was teaching them and saying to them, 'Is it not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations?'" The temple was supposed to be a place where people engaged and encountered God. Jesus walks in and he doesn't see that happening. Much like the fig tree, he does not see the temple as a place where people are encountering God. He's seeing money changers, and he's seeing animals, and he's seeing all of the raucous that's going on. See, what's happening in the temple is there's what's called the court of the Gentiles. The court of the Gentiles, essentially the Jewish people said, "Hey, Gentiles, you can worship our God, but you can't go to the main part of the temple. We'll create a space for you to worship God." And so that's what happens. They have this space, and they can go and pray and worship to God for the most part, until 2 weeks before Passover. Priests invite these money changers and these merchants to come in and set up shop, because the Jewish man is supposed to go, he's supposed to buy some doves and some sheep, and he's supposed to sacrifice it. Well, he usually has Greek and Roman money. He needs someone to exchange that money for him. So the priests have conveniently set up these merchants and these money changers so he can go and exchange that, and then the Jewish man can go over, maybe a couple feet over, and buy himself a sheep and a dove. But the problem with all of this is that is the space where the Gentiles were supposed to be encountering God. Could you imagine trying to offer up a word to your God when you hear the lambs and you hear the money changers and the bartering and all of the noise? And Jesus sees this and says, "Enough. We can't have this." So the question for you and me, for those who follow Jesus, is when people engage with us, what do they find? Do they find a space that's raucous and loud and self-serving, or do they find a place where they sense they're nearer to God? You see, in Ephesians 2, verse 22, Paul is explaining to the Ephesians that Jesus has gotten rid of that temple. That temple's gone, but there's this new temple, and It's actually you and me. God has brought us all together to be a kind of temple. And it says, in him you also are being built together into a dwelling place for God by the Spirit. Into a dwelling place for God by the Spirit. We are now the temple. People find God when they draw close to us. So when they draw close to us, do they find generosity? Do they find graciousness? Do they find a place where they can truly bring their whole self there and meet the God of the universe? So this week, during Holy Week, the second day, Monday, as we go to our places, and I know especially on a Monday, it's hard to talk about. I'm trying to be gracious and loving. We're just trying to get through Monday. And still, we have the honor and privilege of being God's temples. Are we the kind of place the nations of the world can encounter